Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining, and I hope today is going well in terms of all the different sessions you've been doing and that you got a chance to get some lunch. So this session is about digital storytelling and climate futures, and it fits in well with the theme of Cheney 2050 in terms of the chance to kind of travel in time to the year 2050 and kind of tell the story of what you think will be there. So when I've talked about storytelling, I realized the best way to start is by sharing a story. And so I do have a video to share, which is was produced by a secondary school student in London as part of a workshop I led, again, on this theme of digital storytelling and climate futures. And it is a letter from the year 2050. So again, it fits in well with this theme, and some of the ideas in this letter we'll be exploring in the rest of this session. So I'll go ahead and play that now. And the music starts a bit quietly in the beginning, but then if you don't hear her voice after about 30 seconds in, let me know if there's any problems with volume. But it's worked the past couple times. Oops, just go back. Sorry, there are comments that you couldn't hear it. So let me just, I'm going to stop sharing and then start sharing again and see if that makes a difference. Yeah, so it's interesting. Generally, if I mute, you can hear it better, but that didn't work that time. So let me just try one more time, and then if that doesn't work, I'll stay unmuted. So percent tab.
I write to you from 2050. A message from a version of you who is 30 years wiser. A version of you who has made 30 more years of mistakes and lived 30 more years of grief. I live in the year they said we would reach net zero by. The year they said we would have planted billions of trees. Our streets are supposed to be lined with electric charging points and our parking spaces transformed into community gardens. And yet, when I rise in the morning and I open the news, the front page shows a young woman, not much older than you are now, but her eyes speak of suffering you have never had to endure. She carries a baby, wrapped in cloth against her chest, and up to her waist she is engulfed in murky, brown water. Behind her stand the slanted skeletons of wooden houses on stilts. Fake news is reported more often than not in 2050. But the lines etched in this woman's face and the fear written in her eyes are the furthest thing from fake. It is easy to become desensitized to this kind of imagery. Waking up to natural disaster somewhere in the world is the norm now. And those who suffer the most today are the ones who knew what crisis looked like in 2020. The ones who saw the seasons change, saw their crops die, saw the rainforest canopy collapse above them and their land be swallowed by the sea, only to be shut out of conversation and patronized by the media. I know I am one of the lucky ones, and I know that the worst of it is yet to reach me, though it's hard to imagine how much worse things can get here. I suppose you thought that in 2020 as well. I start most days by stepping onto my bike. I join into the mass of city workers who pedal past my house on sweeping cycle lanes. Sun glints down on us from solar panels lined on the tilted London roofs above. In the early morning, families can be seen in local parks harvesting their ration of food from community allotments. By midday, the heat becomes too much and everyone retreats back inside. You know the phrase, as sure as the seasons come and go? Yeah, that doesn't work anymore. Predicting when a heat wave or storm or flood will hit is near impossible. We are in what people have taken to calling the healing, a period of repair, of restoration, of rebuilding. Land across the world has been returned to Indigenous peoples. More girls are going to school than at any point in history. Unlikely alliances have formed between farmers, schools, developers, corporations. Things have changed. But we remain closer to a tipping point that feels comfortable, a precarious balance of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It wasn't like in the films. There was never a point where you breathed a sigh of relief and decided that good had defeated evil. Too many natural wonders were lost due to our actions. Too many species whose fates have been restricted to the history books. Too many lives lost because of the greed and unbridled power of a few. It's hard to feel that we've won, as politicians like to claim. A ticking time bomb remains, and there's lots of work to do.
So taking a step back from that video, just to tell you a little bit more about who I am. So I'm a doctoral student at the University of Oxford in the School of Geography and the Environment. And I have a background in digital communications and kind of working with environmental organizations on videos, websites, social media campaigns, but also working with young people on video projects, so youth video. And my research is in general looking at how secondary schools in the UK are responding to the climate crisis. So I have been, Cheney is one of the schools that is part of my research project. So I've been talking to senior leadership team and teachers and people with different roles in the school about sustainability, but then also working on this project of digital storytelling with young people. And dig into that more, but actually before we get much further, I wanted to share the link for Slido. So Slido is a website where you can add some feedback, answer some questions and polls. The 2 points in this presentation will be using it. And so just so you have that handy, you can use the little QR code thing on my slide on the lower right, but I also put a link in the chat. And so yeah, so you have that handy. You don't need it yet, but just so you have it handy. So the kind of question of why talk about future and story when it comes to talking about climate change. And so starting with the future, it kind of comes from, the youth climate strikes have been framed around this idea of Fridays for Future. And that's because, of course, climate change is something where the causes are now, but the consequences are tomorrow. They're in the future, and sometimes tens of years, decades away, or geographically distant. So the actions now have consequences for future, and the actions by current generations have consequences for future generations. And in some ways, it's an intergenerational justice issue. And so young people looking ahead at the future kind of definitely feel that in many ways. So climate change is an issue for the future. Education itself is also something that relates to the future. It's supposed to be preparing you for the future. And in many ways, that's around qualifications and careers and higher education. But there are also questions about what education should be doing to prepare young people for climate adaptation and climate resilience, and kind of cutting across all of the different subject areas if we need to be thinking more about climate change. So Teach the Future is a campaign from students organizing for sustainability and the UK climate strikes to have education reform in the UK so that climate change is a bit more embedded in the curriculum. So that's the future, looking ahead. In terms of story, in some ways, that's kind of looking back into the past, millennia, because story is how people communicate. And just kind of skimming the surface of talking about story and narratives in this case. But if you go back to before there was the written word. People told stories to one another, and it was through that that they learned how to survive. It's how they had identity and kind of a sense of culture that was shared, also how they entertained each other. And so you can see these elements of story and storytelling, that go back generations upon generations, that are now embedded in kind of big blockbuster films or internet memes. Storytelling is something that cuts across all of that. And then digital storytelling, just to go into a little bit more of my research process, it's been developed by a group in California called the Story Center, and you bring people together for a workshop, and over a couple of days, they'll come in maybe having no experience making videos, but by the end of it, they've produced something. And it tends to be a very personal story, and it's kind of very reflective. So they reflect on some important moment in their life and something that they want to share with other people, and they might bring to it some photographs or some other visual materials. But that process of reflection leads them to writing a script, and then that script becomes a voiceover in their video, and then they bring the visuals to it and sounds to it. So it's similar to the example I just showed you, but the difference is that when I've been doing this workshop, instead of looking back, we look forward. So we project to the year 2050 in the kind of theme of Cheney 2050, and reflect on what could happen between now and then, and put ourselves, a person, in that story. Again, make sure it's a human story. So that's another reason that storytelling is relevant for climate change, is that often we talk in terms of numbers and facts and the science of climate, or kind of the numbers and costs, costs and benefits of climate policy. But people will be moved emotionally by a story, a human story, and they might be more willing to change their lives, or be part of social transformation based on stories and kind of a vision for the future. So this photo shows a trial run of a workshop I did at the Museum of Natural History in Oxford in October half term, and it was over 2 days, and that was kind of the one time I was able to do this in person. So I adapted it to do an online version, which was where that other video came from with the London Schools Eco Network. And in some ways, some of the themes that we're going to talk about for the next half hour kind of come out of these workshops. So this is kind of an abridged version of that. So in general, this is getting at this question of like, what is the story of climate change? And thinking of it in terms of the stories you might be familiar with in terms of movies or books. What are these kind of big narratives? And to start with one, because it also gives us a foundation in talking about climate, it's the story of climate science and the kind of this story of discovery and also collaboration between scientists. And so this is a graphic that shows the temperature, the average annual temperature in Oxford since 1814. Oxford is rare in the sense to have this really long record of temperature. And so for over 2 centuries, you can see that pattern of year on year, that average temperature. And you can also see that it's variable, that it kind of, every year it might be a bit warmer, a bit cooler for the first 150 years of this or so. And then a new trend starts to emerge where things are getting redder and redder and redder, pink then red. And that's a warming that is kind of undeniable. It's just thermometers outside. This is not kind of something that's debatable. But it's also something that is quite alarming, that trend. And in some ways, it's the idea that, for the past 10 years, past decade, a number of those years, most of those years were the highest recorded temperatures. And there's, a good chance that, 2021 might be one of the warmest years ever recorded in this history. And there's also a chance that 2021 could be one of the coolest years of the next 50 years, as in this warming trend could continue. At least that's what we're looking at right now. Another graphic that explores some of this is the climate spiral. So the stripes and the spiral both come from Ed Hawkins, who's a researcher at the University of Reading, a climate scientist. And this is global temperatures month by month over these years. And I think this is, again, really interesting to show this variation from month to month, from year to year, this kind of natural variability, and then a trend kind of starting in the middle of the last century, where, because of the color coding, because of the way this illustration works, you can kind of really see how we're spiraling outwards. And we're spiraling outwards from kind of that baseline of the industrial level, that's kind of the 0 degrees Celsius. And then this global average is moving out towards, if you follow kind of any kind of climate change stuff or have learned about it, people talk about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees of warming. And that's what the Paris Climate Agreement is based on, limiting it to 2 or ideally 1.5. And you can see that we've already experienced 1 degree of warming since 1850, and we're brushing up against 1.5. So that's the temperature record. That's what that tells us. But the other kind of scientific discovery, understanding of the world, natural world, has to do with our understanding of the atmosphere and the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And for that, the kind of journey of discovery takes us to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, kind of as far as you can get from where we are, to the big island of Hawaii, to the top of a volcano, a dormant volcano called Mauna Loa. And there's a research station there. And Charles Keeling is a scientist who set this up in the 1950s. And the reason he put it there was because it was very far from any city, from any factory, from any highway, anything that could influence the local concentrations of gases in the air. And so all of those gases kind of mix in the atmosphere. And then by the time you're on the top of this volcano in Hawaii, you get a snapshot of the global concentration of these gases. And so one of the things he was measuring was carbon dioxide. And so from the 1950s onward, this has been measured, first by Charles Keeling and now by his son. And you can look up the Keeling curve and go to a website, the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, where you can see what the most recent measurement was of CO2 in the atmosphere, parts per million. And the trend is pretty clear. We've gone from between 310 and 320 parts per million to over 400 over that time period. There's also the oscillation, which is just kind of interesting. The Earth essentially breathes it seasonally because there's more green growing things in the northern hemisphere, and so that means they kind of suck up some of the carbon dioxide part of the year, and then that kind of, when it becomes winter here, that kind of shifts back out. And so you kind of get that oscillation there in terms of the carbon dioxide concentration, but the trend is clear. And in science, if you kind of measure two things simultaneously, it's a correlation. So you kind of, they correlate, they both kind of moved in a certain direction at the same time, but it's not causality. You can't necessarily just by seeing these two things at the same time prove that one caused the other. But that is where the international collaboration comes in, of scientists from around the world in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This picture, which I've kind of faded out, is them winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008 for their work. And it was thousands of scientists working together to really kind of synthesize our understanding of the climate system. And that gets captured in reports they put together. So this is the synthesis report of the assessment report, which came out a few years back, and they're working on the latest version of that now. Again, it's the state of our understanding of climate change. And also a few years ago, there was a special report that was put out, and this is where people talking about kind of this decade, at the time it was, we have 12 years, now it's kind of, we've got 9 years between now and 2030 to really make a difference and to kind of change this trajectory of keeping global warming to within 1.5 degrees. So this is, again, the story of science, scientific collaboration. But one thing that's important to note is this is the language of the story of science. So this is pulled from that report on the left, and it's their kind of summary statement of the causes of climate change. And it's kind of maybe not the most accessible language. It's very, very carefully crafted in terms of what this says. Dozens of scientists would have been involved in crafting this language, again, based on the research of thousands of scientists. But this is not, there's no kind of human face to this. There's no kind of narrative that people can plug into. There's no emotional way of understanding this. It's very scientific in terms of the language. And also the way that scientists talk is sometimes different than the way other people talk. So for example, the extremely likely towards the end in italics, that could sound like you're kind of hedging what you're saying, or it's a caveat. But for a scientist, and they kind of even go into this in detail in this report, that means that there's a lot of data, so a lot of information, a lot of consensus, to the point that they can say something with 95% to 100% confidence. So 95 to 100% confidence is like as confident as you can be as a scientist, but it comes across maybe as you're like not 100% sure, which just, again, as we communicated, is quite different. So again, there's limitations to the story of climate change being just a story of science. Another story of climate change is the story of a natural disaster or a disaster movie. So if you think about kind of movies with a tornado or an asteroid or alien invasion. And this, of course, is because of the human impact of climate change. So we're talking about these average temperatures. We're really also talking about changes in weather patterns that could mean, in terms of rainfall, there might be more rain in some places that leads to flooding. In other places, there might be less rain, leads to drought, leads to wildfires, especially when coupled with warming. And so that has an impact on natural systems, on wildlife, on ecosystems, and it has an impact on human systems, on individuals, on communities. And in Oxford, there's a group called Climate Outreach, which does a lot of research on how to talk about climate change and also visuals that are can move people. So these visuals come from some of the work they've done, and also in partnership with The Guardian, to, instead of just when you visualize climate change, have it be a polar bear far away, have it be something that actually resonates with people. So for example, on the left, that looks like it could be anywhere in England. And, in Oxfordshire and Oxford, there is flooding sometimes. And, it's something that people could face as a real consequence of climate change. And then on the right, it's more of painting a picture of what the human toll of, say, wildfires might be, and that emotional toll. The problem with the disaster movie story for climate change is that if you were to pick a movie that you would be a bit character in, you probably wouldn't pick a disaster movie, because not everybody makes it to the end. It's all about survival, and people in a disaster movie have very little control over the disaster. They're just trying to, get through it. So as a story, it's very disempowering. So if the science story doesn't have an emotional punch, this story has tons of emotional punch, but feels very disempowering. And so then what's another story? An alternative story around climate change would be maybe more akin to kind of the battle between good and evil, a story, a Harry Potter or a Star Wars type epic story. And so just to have Greta Thunberg up, over the past few years, the youth climate movement, which has grown up, with her as a kind of leader, very visible leader, is kind of in some ways a much more empowering story, because it's a story of action and activism, and some young people see themselves in that and have joined in and have gone on climate strikes and things, and others don't. And I think it's an interesting question as to why you might not see yourself in this story, but it's also, in terms of kind of, is it a helpful narrative? It's a story that's unfolding, and it's a story that's kind of antagonistic, and so we don't know how it ends, and we, there's a question of that battle between good and evil, and kind of maybe a less powerful group against a more powerful group, and will it turn out okay? But to in terms of Greta, she from the start has talked about the future, and has framed things as a story. So this is an excerpt from one of her first big public speeches, which was in 2018 at COP24. So the COPs are the UN climate meetings, and we've got COP26 happening in Glasgow this year. So this was a couple cycles before this, 3 years ago, and one of her first, again, big prominent speeches. And I'll just go ahead and play again her talking about the future, telling a story about the future.
The year 2078, I will celebrate my 75th birthday. If I have children, maybe they will spend that day with me. Maybe they will ask me about you. Maybe they will ask why you didn't do anything while there still was time to act. You say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their very eyes. Until you start focusing on what needs to be done rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope. We cannot solve a crisis without treating it as a crisis.
So at this point, kind of turn the question on you, and if Slido, if you want to get that up through that link in the chat, or just going to slido.com and putting in climate stories. The poll will open in just a second, but to set it up, the question is really, how do you feel about the future, especially the future in this kind of context through this lens of climate change? And so when I did the workshop at the museum, the Natural History Museum in Oxford, they had done other events on environmental issues, and they had set up, printed out these cards, and on each card was a different word that represents a different emotion, and then they color coded it, kind of reddish hued cards, bluish hued green, and so the full list is here, and it's a wide range of ways you might feel about anything, but in particular thinking about the future or thinking about climate change, and so take a look at these. This is not comprehensive, so there might also be something that doesn't resonate with you, or you're just missing, how you really feel isn't there. So feel free to use some of these or not, but I'll open up the poll in a second. The idea is to pick 2 or 3 of these that resonate. So I'll go ahead and get this open now. And so if you're on Slido, you should now see a poll that has popped up from just the Q&A option. And please take a minute and enter in, write a word and then send it, and then write another one and another one, ideally 3 different words that reflect how you feel about climate change in the future. And I'll give everybody a minute to do that. Again, the link to Slido is in the chat, but also you can just go slido.com and enter climate stories as the ID or whatever you need at the top. So again, we'll give people a minute to fill this out. Add some things in. Let me know if you're having problems with Slido, but again, you can just follow the link and it should take you right there. I'll stay on this for another minute so people can enter stuff in. So please, again, everybody, it'd be great if you could hop in. I feel like when I've done this with different groups, there's generally a range of different reactions, and that's again kind of totally natural within any group. But also within a single person, you might have reactions that feel almost contradictory, to be kind of worried and hopeful at the same time. And it's a big, complicated issue. So it's interesting. This is a more hopeful group than the last one I had in Cheney 2050. But there is still that range of different reactions, different thoughts. And, in some ways, if we only talk about climate change as a scientific, subject in the curriculum, or if it's in geography and you're looking at people and solutions, but you're not actually, again, it's still kind of far away and abstract, sometimes we don't take the time to really reflect on how it resonates with us as individuals and what that means for what we feel like we can do moving forward. So that's in part what this is for, is to kind of create the space to be reflecting on the emotional connection to this issue, and also to be thinking about resilience. And again, storytelling is all about that emotional connection. And in some ways, storytelling when it comes to climate change is about creating a vision for the future, using creativity and imagination to make that possible. So to move ahead, I wanted to briefly go through a few different future scenarios. Future scenarios are a big part of climate science, kind of our understanding of greenhouse gases and what they're doing to natural and human systems, but also climate policy. And when you kind of weigh up the pros and cons of different approaches, whether it's a tax on carbon or something else. But they're also, future scenarios are stories themselves. And so I really like this breakdown from this group, the Great Transition, which shows like how we might branch off in different directions, and even within those branches, how there might be alternatives. And this is not a comprehensive list of different options, but one thing I like is that sometimes we just see 2 options. We either see the utopia where everything's good, or the dystopia where everything falls apart. And there's a lot of space in between those. And there's also ways in which they're kind of wrapped up into each other, depending on who you are or where you are. So to kind of briefly go through these different scenarios, in their conventional worlds branch, that's kind of the business as usual. So it's kind of a continuation of how we've been living for the past century or so. And the market forces version is very much kind of leaving it to business, to capitalism, to markets to solve this problem. And this cartoon is a bit over the top, but it kind of gets at the idea that in some ways that could be seen as successful. The economic growth might continue. Luxury goods might be available to people who have the means, but some people will be left behind, and so there will be some sort of inequality. And there's questions of the ability of that approach to really address serious social problems. The policy reform vision scenario is kind of, if the climate accord, the Paris Climate Agreement, works and all the different countries do what they say they're going to do, and they hold up their end of the bargain, and this thing holds, and by 2050 or kind of the second half of the century we achieve net zero carbon emissions, but we continue living the way we do now. So in this vision you can see like cars driving around. There'll be electric cars, but they'll still be cars, and planes flying, but there'll be maybe alternative fuels, and a boardroom of a corporation, and kind of that business continuing, kind of business as usual. That's one vision. Another branch of this is the barbarization. So this is where we get into the dystopian stuff, kind of a bit more of what you might find in science fiction, whether it's films or novels. And I don't want to dwell too much on this, but the fortress world, this vision it's basically, when you leave it to market forces and there's inequality, but then that inequality gets so stark that there's some people outside of a wall and some people inside of a wall. And there's, armed guards protecting the haves from the have-nots. So that's the fortress world. The breakdown is when the wall falls and things fall apart. So this is your kind of zombie apocalypse scenario, and everybody's in it together, for worse, for better. So then to move to the great transition. So there's, this is clearly where this group is leading us to. They want us to be gravitating towards one of these two visions. And so one vision, eco-communalism, is very much a community-based, more localized solution. So I think we got a little bit of a preview of this during the past year with the lockdowns, when we were sometimes, our world shrunk, sometimes just to our home, but often just, again, to our surrounding community, and maybe being a little more aware of who our neighbors are and how we rely on them, and also maybe a little more aware of where our food comes from and what we might be able to do to grow food, or in other cases, kind of local energy systems and what that means. And in some ways, this is going back in time to a simpler time when people, simpler way people lived centuries ago, but maybe aided with modern technology and a little bit more awareness and intention. So that's the eco-communalism. And then the new paradigm is kind of the last vision they have as an alternative. And I kind of see it as kind of eco-communalism with policy reform. So it's, it's familiar in some ways, and yet it's also, it implies a bit more of a social transformation, a real transition into a different way of living, but maybe not just by going local. Maybe there's new technology that allows us to get around and fly long distances, or, a monorail type thing, Hyperloop, whatever it is, but it's much lower carbon and, completely decarbonized. And maybe we have a different relationship in terms of our relationship with nature in a place, in terms of biodiversity or in terms of food. But it's kind of, this is very much the kind of shiny, happy people version of these different scenarios. So, why talk about these scenarios? In some ways, again, it's like when we think about the future, we kind of are again telling a story of what could be. But there's also questions of how that relates to the present. So this is a quote attributed to William Gibson, who's a science fiction writer, coined the term cyberspace, behind the steampunk subgenre of speculative fiction. And he's credited as saying the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I feel like this is often presented by people who are really into kind of futuristic technology, to talk about artificial intelligence or the latest iPhone or Tesla, that's what's here, but not evenly distributed. But I think you could also say the same for the negatives, that fortress world where there's a wall between the haves and the have-nots is not that dissimilar from the border between Mexico and the US, and how, again, some people are experiencing now, are on the front lines of climate change. They're kind of experiencing what we might be afraid will happen. And then the flip side of that is that there's some people are now experimenting with different ways of living or different technologies that could make for a greener future. So that also is maybe here already, but we just need to find a way to distribute it more evenly and more fairly. So this leads us to the big question for this session, which is really like, what is the future you want, and how do you articulate that? So that first video we watched was in some ways kind of an expression of both hopes and fears of someone who went through this workshop, kind of a longer form of this workshop, exploring the future. But in general, the space that we tried to create was like, what is the future you want? What is it that you'd like to see happen? And can you paint a picture of that? And that's, again, where the storytelling comes in. If you can paint a really compelling picture of it, that might be a way of moving forward and making it a reality. So just going to show a quick video. This is a 1-minute video by a coalition of environmental groups that was really reflecting back on this past year and some of the challenges of this year, and this point we're in, where we might, it's quite unique to have everything to have stopped for a while, and for us to be able to think a little bit more deliberately about what we want the new normal to be. So this is from my campaign, Imagine for 1 minute. And sharing it through Teams doesn't really capture this video because it's this very fast-paced thing, but I'll go ahead and play this now.
This could be the most important minute of your day.
We have been through difficult times
and face big problems ahead.
But every crisis contains both danger and opportunity.
You can play your part.
Right now.
Right now.
Puddles, please close your eyes.
Imagine the better future we could have.
Imagine that future.
What does it look like for you?
for the people you love.
How do we lift each other up
and make it fair?
How do we protect nature
and save our shared homes?
Picture that future you want.
Now open your eyes.
It's time to talk about the future we want.
So again, the longer format of these workshops, that we'd spend more time crafting a letter from the future, turning that into a video, or doing some alternatives with kind of a media project. In this session, we've just got 10 minutes left, and so the idea was to, in the spirit of Cheney 2050 and the Rumble Museum, think about a museum of the future. So I'll go ahead and get this up. So it's through Slido again. And so hopefully you still have the link up. If you didn't get it the first time, it's in the chat, or you can go to slido.com and do climate stories. And the prompt is this, picture yourself in the year 2050, come across a museum. Again, maybe it's you're visiting Cheney again for some reason, and you're kind of walking through the Rumble Museum's exhibits, and something catches your eye. It's kind of exploring the what has happened between now, 2021, and 2050, and how kind of life has changed in those 3 decades. And so it's one object in this museum. So just, type in an object. You can write whatever you want. This is a totally open-ended thing. But the idea in some ways is to think about how that world might change and how you might want it to change, and what is something you think should be in a museum, in the sense that that's the only place that exists because it's kind of archaic and it's a thing from the past. Or what should be in a museum because it should be elevated. It should be on a pedestal because it's what has made the future that you want possible, whatever that might be. So we'll leave this open for a couple minutes again. Feel free to type in anything. No right or wrong answers on this one. And it'll just appear for everyone. So again, slido.com. Climate stories, and we'll give people a minute just to type in a few things. terms of the leather jacket, which was mentioned, I think that's a really interesting one. Also, just yeah, we've got kind of two sides of a coin on this one, which is the idea of meat alternatives and how we use animal products, and reading about leather alternatives made from mushrooms, and you know how again there could be amazing innovations in that kind of stuff. Yeah, some interesting ideas in here. Keep them coming. I'll leave this going for another minute or so. And in some ways, this is getting at the idea that like even an object, so if you go to a museum now, if you go to the Ashmolean, there's an object there and it tells a story. It tells a story about a culture and a history and a period of time. And there's a power to that, the things we put on a pedestal or the things we relegate to a museum. So this is a question of, again, the future and engaging with 2050. So thanks everybody for kind of putting some stuff in there. I'm just gonna move ahead to some closing thoughts. So basically, you know, if you engage with climate change and think about it or talk about it to other people, sometimes you might get a reaction that's a bit of a shrug, whether that's people in your family, other people at your school. Maybe it's kind of how you feel about it. And this could be because you have other priorities. You know, there's other stuff going on in your life. It could also be because you feel somewhat powerless. And so what other reaction is there? So there's that. And it's kind of an expression of like disengagement, not really being engaged. And then there's people who really get fired up and passionate about climate change, and whether it's through something they learned at school or a documentary they saw or kind of other kind of self-education on social media. And then they quickly get to the scream and kind of a really fatalistic view that it's too late to do anything or there's nothing we can do. And that sense of anxiety that comes with climate change, sometimes climate anxiety or eco anxiety. And I think as educators, as researchers, as kind of young people who might engage with this issue, like what's important is to create space between those two things, in between like the disengagement and the freaking out, because it's kind of in that space where we can really shape the future actively. So it's a bit corny, but a word for that is hope. And that's to distinguish hope from optimism. So if you're very optimistic about everything, kind of have a sunny outlook and you think everything's going to be okay, and in some ways that is not itself a very empowering view, because it'll be okay, don't worry about it, versus pessimism, which is kind of generally negative, and maybe that's not very helpful either. Whereas hope is the idea that a better future is possible, but it's going to take work. You're going to be involved in that work and making that a reality. So in some ways, this is much more empowering, but it does mean that we're in relationship to each other and to the natural world. And where the storytelling comes in, when you think about the future, a hopeful future, it's figuring out how to craft that vision. Again, bringing creativity, imagination to what the future could be. And then once that has been articulated in a way that kind of connects with other people, that's kind of the first step towards making it a reality. So with that, we've got a couple more minutes. Don't know if anybody has any questions or wanted to say anything more about their object in the Rumble Museum of 2050, or the earlier feedback on kind of emotional response, or kind of stories of climate. Feel free to add something to the chat or hop off mute. Again, we've got a couple minutes before this wraps up. I want to see if anybody does anything. I'll just go ahead and can mention the whole ideas wall. Like if any ideas came from this session, thinking about what Cheney could be like in 2050, it means starting now to make those a reality. So that's, I think, the point of the ideas wall, is to start sharing some of those ideas and some of that vision for the future. And again, if there's no other questions, I'll just mention too that part of my research is a survey that's like a chance to get feedback from sixth form students about the future, about hope, about kind of broadly what you think about sustainability. So this is something that I would really appreciate if people could fill in. I think maybe the organizers of the of the Cheney 2050 event will be sharing this. I'm not sure if it's just people who've been in my session or more broadly, but it'd be really helpful to fill that in. It just takes 15 minutes and explores some of these same themes that I've been talking about.